Mobile. The 327th Glider Regiment came down here, and the 501 went through the town and came out on the road to what became the East Perimeter. They were put right in the most direct path of the German assault, because they were coming out of the east like this. And way back when Colonel Johnson was commander of the 501st, he always said that his regiment was going to win the war. And the general said, well, prove it. So whenever there were bad situations like this, they put the 501 in the most hazardous, exposed positions. So Hurd's battalion wound up at a hamlet called Bisery here on the East Perimeter. That's where the 2nd Battalion was. The 3rd Battalion was down at Warden. And the 1st Battalion was at Neff and Mont. I don't see them marked on this map, but they were in between. So, go to the next one. One of the great stories that I heard about Alan Hurd didn't come from him. He never talked about details of combat, but he had a buddy in New Orleans named Louis Fry, F-R-E-Y, and Fry told me that there was only a couple guys that knew this, but on Christmas Eve, Hurd's S2 section, which was about 8 men, were in this big chateau at Bisery trying to get warm. It was Christmas Eve night, and about 2 in the morning, some German troops came in the woods right outside the chateau, and they started singing Christmas carols. They knew there was American troops inside the building, and the melodies were the same that we know. They were just, the lyrics were in German. So after they sang for a couple hours, they suddenly launched an attack, and they came in the courtyard of this place, and they started hurling Molotov cocktails, and they set the building on fire. Well, Hurd and his buddies came out the cellar window and made a dash. There was a wall around most of the courtyard. They made a dash for the wall, and it was an eerie scene because everything was lit up by the flames from these Molotov cocktails. So Alan Hurd was coming up, bringing up the rear, and he had found a Nazi flag in this building. It's a big, long flag, and he just haphazardly stuffed one corner of it in his back pants pocket. So when he ran out in the courtyard, it was dragging on the ground behind him like a red cape. And his buddy Louis Fry stopped before he left the courtyard and looked back, and Hurd saw these Germans concentrating on setting the building on fire, and they had their backs turned, and they weren't aware there was American troops behind them. So Hurd took advantage of that situation, and he ran right up to them, flipped off the safety on his M1, which would fire as fast as you could pull the trigger, and he started gunning these Germans down at point blank range. He must have shot 6 or 8 of them before they knew what hit them. And with the flames and the red cape and the scenario of what happened, it was surrealistic, and Louis Fry couldn't say enough about that when he told me about it. But out of all the guys that ran out of the courtyard, he may have been the only one that paused long enough to look back and see what was happening. So these are things that some of Hurd's actions, only a handful of people knew what he did. He knew what he did, but he was very conflicted, because if you ever met him, he was a very gentle, refined, and intellectual character. And he had a lot of mental dissonance because he couldn't reconcile all the people that he killed in the war to his otherwise gentle nature. And that's why he never came to reunions, and he didn't even want them to send the regimental newsletter to his house. He asked me to tell them to stop sending it. So he was tormented by the war, and I knew him for 4 decades, but you know, he never could overcome that. But this is the incident that's on the cover of Denise's book. When Kim Fujiwara, the artist, came over to the house, he wanted to look at weapons and equipment so he could draw them better in his book. And he asked me to put on an M43 combat suit, a helmet, and to hold an M1, and to pose as Hurd would have as when he charged in that courtyard. So when you look at the cover of the book, it's he's standing there firing his rifle with flames behind him, And that's where that came from. So is that pretty much what you want me to?
Well, during all this time, my grandmother had not received any letters and took it in her mind to write to General McAuliffe and see what happened to my son. Amazingly, he wrote a very nice letter in response, concluding with, and my dad was called Alan at this time, but his first name really was Lyman, which is confusing. But I was able to learn from an officer in Lyman's unit that he is in good health and is doing full duty. I ask that he be requested to write to you at once. Since the German offensive of December, mail delivery has been very uncertain. It is just now returning to normal. I hope by this time you have heard from your son. Well, this didn't go over too well with my dad. Mother dear, listen to your son. The Army, unlike the Boy Scouts, is a highly impersonal organization. If you don't hear from me for quite some time, don't get excited and start writing to generals. They have enough on their minds besides having to worry about every mother's son in the outfit. McAuliffe called personally, causing me no end of embarrassment. You just stay away from generals and confine your letters to just one poor small PFC. Shortly after that, excuse me. This letter followed shortly on the heels of the previous. Try and curb your worrying. Death now means very little. I've seen men die all around me. I lost my best friend in Bastogne. The damage is done. The blood has been spilled all over the world. It's too late to worry and cry now. The important thing isn't if we come back. No, the all-important issue is, will the future generation of men have to leave like we did to fight and die? The 101st was relieved in February, and soldiers rode in boxcars back to France, where they waited for the next jump, possibly into Berlin. Luckily, the Germans began to surrender, so that final jump proved unnecessary. In a letter home, my dad describes the French countryside as viewed from the train. In the fields of France, you can read the history of the war. Foxholes, thousands of them, forests split and torn by artillery shells, burned out vehicles of all descriptions, bomb craters, ration cans, ammunition boxes, all this and so much more shout their gruesome history at you as you pass by. Eventually, the 501st joined the 101st at the abandoned Nazi headquarters in Berchtesgaden, where they did some celebrating, including riding horses from the SS horse farm. The Germans officially surrendered May 8, 1945. On June 26, the 501st was inactivated. Some soldiers went home, others went to different units. So by the time they finally really got home, there often wasn't much fanfare. My dad actually was sent to a glider unit for a little while. And as he remembers, we were stationed in Austria when the news was released about the surrender, and that was the end of it all. They asked where we wanted to go, and based on that, we were placed on different boats. I think we were also given $100. We had our choice of different boats. I decided I wanted to go to Washington, D.C. I wanted to see President Truman because I had read a book about war and peace, and I felt I could help prevent this. And here he laughs at himself. But he actually did go to Washington, D.C., but Truman was a little bit busy, so he ended up talking to Michigan Senator Vandenberg, and he shares some additional memories from the end of the war. I was engaged to be married, but after getting back all that experience, I decided I'd better wait. It was unfortunate because Mary Jane hadn't changed, so it was difficult, especially for her. She had waited 3 years, and he did not end up marrying her. I asked him if he was treated as a hero when he came back, but he said, no, I think that's come later and gradually built up as time goes on, especially today. At that time, there were just so many of us. Jumping way into the future here, this is 1994. My dad donated a flag to the Detroit Library in honor of the soldiers who died at Normandy, and they had a flag raising on June 6th. He was interviewed by a local TV station, Channel 2, that filmed the ceremony. And the interview asked him, what do you think the young soldiers who died on the beach at Normandy would say to you today if they could talk? I think what comes to mind is their bravery, was my dad's answer. I'm locked in on those who lost their lives and trying to think about how we can make sure their lives count for something and this tragedy will not happen again.
While we're figuring out how to make my PowerPoint work, I invite you to stay a little bit longer. My presentation's probably going to be about the same length as Denise's was, but mine is about how I met Mr. Hurd and what I knew about him from talking to the guys that served with him. And okay, thank you. I was a student at history major at Wayne State University in 1970 and studied under Dr. Alfred Kelly, who was one of the most noted historians in the country. His specialty was American diplomacy before Pearl Harbor. But anyways, I did a 12 credit hour thesis for him on the 101st Airborne Division, and I interviewed 93 guys just in the Tri-County Detroit area who had been in the 101st in World War II, and that's how I met Mr. Hurd. But anyways, there's a lot of synchronicity involved in this story because, as you know, Mr. Hurd passed away around 2009, and some years before that, he said, do me a favor after I'm gone. I have a daughter named Denise who lives in Farmington Hills, and he said, she doesn't know anything about what I did in the war. He said, I'm asking that you go look her up after I'm gone and just tell her about your books. And if she reads your books, there's enough info in there that she can get a general idea of what happened to me in the war. So when I finally got around to doing it, it was almost 10 years later, it was 2017, but I also live in Farmington, so it wasn't too far of a trip for me to go. And I went over there not expecting to do anything except to tell Denise and her family about my books. I had no idea she was going to seize upon this information and research it, amplify it, and make a whole project and a book out of it. And that was the last thing I expected to happen. But another thing is that there were 3 Japanese American families in my neighborhood when I grew up on the far west side of Detroit. The Bandos, the Namuras, and the Fujiwaras. And there was 3 brothers in the Fujiwara family, and the youngest brother graduated from high school about 7 or 8 years after I did, but he's a very well-known artist in the Tri-County area now. His name is Kim Fujiwara. I was never close to that family, but I see them at the Cody High School reunion picnics every summer. and I know who they are. So I got an email out of the blue from Kim Fujiwara, and he just said, how nice of you to help Denise with information about her dad. And I was thinking, how did you get involved with this? But it's just a coincidence that the artist that she commissioned to illustrate her book is a Japanese-American guy from my old neighborhood. So that was another odd coincidence that came out of all this. But anyways, when I met Alan Hurd, I used to see him on the Wayne State campus walking up and down Cass Avenue. And he was a very distinguished guy. He was only about 50 years old then, but he had snow white hair already and a white mustache. And he would wear all white. He'd wear a white polo shirt and white shorts. And he always had a tennis racket in his hand. And he was a competitor, you know. He was from a generation where competition was a very important aspect of life in America, you know. In another age, he probably would have been an anti-war protester, but such a thing wouldn't have crossed his mind in World War II. What he knew he had to do in World War II was to go and serve and do the best he could to defeat the enemy. And he found out very early in his Army career that he was a poor shot with a rifle. He could not qualify in the rifle range. They call it, you boloed, you failed to qualify. And he started out in a rifle company, D Company, 2nd Battalion, and they saw his IQ scores and they said, this guy doesn't belong in a rifle company, he should be in the intelligence section. So they sent him to the battalion scout section, and that's how that happened. Anyways, this is Hurd as he looked during the war, and then as I knew him, the picture on the right was taken in my home in 1980 when I had him get together with Leo Gillis, who was with him the day he got hit in the chest there at Villeneuve in Normandy. And to understand the 501, you have to know that they had a blood and guts commander named Howard R. Johnson, who was born June 18, 1903, so he was in his 40s at this time, but he had been commander of the 1st Special Service Force, and he didn't think it was going to go anywhere, so he asked for a new assignment, and they gave him his own regiment of paratroopers, and he was known for his colorful anti-Axis speeches. He was very dramatic, and he drove his Jeep like a madman. Officers weren't supposed to drive their own Jeep. They were supposed to have an enlisted man drive them. He actually drove so recklessly one time that he flipped his Jeep over and cracked several vertebrae in his back. When he came back from that, and when he had the 501 starting November 42 at Camp Toccoa, he had these pep rallies every morning, and he would come out and he'd say, who's going to get their train ticket today? Because anybody that washed out of the training, washed out of the runs, they kicked them out, sent them to other units. Then he'd say, who's the best? And they'd all scream, we are. And he'd say, what are we here for? Fight. Who are we going to kill? Well, insert your enemy of choice. The Japs, the Nazis, whatever. Mussolini, whatever. So, anyways, he was such a wild man that he would come out every morning and had a heavy punching bag outside his tent. He'd come out with his red long johns on and spar with the bag. Then he had a plywood, life-size target of Tojo, Hitler, and Mussolini, and he would grab his Randall Bowie knife and throw it and grunt like a bull ape, and he would talk to the targets. He'd say, you spaghetti-eating wop, you slam-eyed bastard. He'd grab that knife and throw it, and sometimes it would bounce back. One time it bounced back and stuck in his foot. But anyways, he was a wild man, and here you can see on the picture on the left, that's just a small group that he's talking to, but he knew that these guys had enlisted in a patriotic fervor. They were driven by war movies from the 40s, which were very extreme, and he gave them what they wanted. He gave them the kind of language they wanted, and so it was a very gung-ho outfit. Oh, and I forgot to mention, every morning when the troops fell out for training, D, E, and F company, 2nd Battalion, would be in their formations, not a formal formation, just assembled in groups, and they would have growling contests in the morning to see which company could growl louder than the other ones. And D company, which Hurd was in at the time, was commanded by a captain named Raymond Jones, and they were known as the company what growls, because they could growl louder than anybody else. And anyways, Hurd left there and he went to Battalion S2. So I met Bill Sefton, his old lieutenant, in Grand Rapids in 1972, and he was one of the best storytellers in the division, as evidenced by him writing copy for advertising and opening his own advertising agency in Grand Rapids. So when I first met Bill, I did about 9 hours of tape recorded interviews with him, which I still have. And this was even before cassette tape players. I'd take a big reel-to-reel tape recorder out, and my interviews with them are on big reels of tape this big. And he said, by any chance, have you interviewed a guy named Alan Hurd? And I said, yeah, I know him. He said, fascinating character. He said, he was in my S2 section, and I've never met anyone else like him. And I can agree with that, because in the over 1,000 people I interviewed for that division, I never met anyone remotely like Alan Hurd. So this is a color slide. There wasn't a lot of color taken at that time, but Fred Baines from New York took this picture and a bunch of others. And Alan Hurd's right here with Joe Newman, who got shot through the shoulder on D-Day. His buddy Maurice Sandquist from New York. And Pop Dornick, who was his best friend that he mentioned being killed at Bastogne later. Bart Tantallo, who was killed in Normandy. And this is Louis Fry from New Orleans. He's the one that described Hurd with the Nazi flag trailing out of his pocket on Christmas Eve. Okay, and here's Bart Tantallo again. He was lying on a big pile of cow manure at Hell's Corners on June 7th, the day after D-Day, and a German paratrooper battalion was walking right towards them. And they walked into an ambush. They didn't know this American force was blocking their path to Carentan. And Tantallo was lying on his manure pile chewing tobacco with his buddy Jim Purifoy from Arkansas. Purifoy moved to Madison Heights, Michigan after the war, and it turns out it's a small world because Jim Purifoy's children went to school with my first wife in Madison Heights, and after a couple of decades he moved back to Arkansas. But anyways, Bart Tantallo saw the Germans coming, and before the shooting started, he said to Jim Purifoy, what do you want me to tell your mommy and daddy when I get back to see them after the war? And Purifoy said, don't worry about it, because I'm going to go back and talk to them myself. A few minutes later, the battle started, and Tantallo got shot right between the eyes, right next to Purifoy, and killed. So this is Jim Purifoy with another guy from the S2 section who was also killed. Joe Miserak was killed in Holland. This is a road outside their tent camp at Lady Craven's estate near Newbury, England. And this is what Jim Purifoy looked like when I knew him in the 70s. But as I said, small world, because his kids went to school with my first wife. And Joe Miserak, who you saw in the picture I just showed, he had bad news from home. I don't know if he had a Dear John letter or what, but he lost all interest in doing what he had to do to preserve his life. And the day they went up to the island, they were digging foxholes on the main dike, and they could hear German artillery fire on the other side of the river. It was a pretty wide river, kind of comparable to the Detroit River in width. And when they heard the guns fire, they dropped their shovels and run and take cover in a barn. Well, Miserak just stood there one time when the shells were coming in, and they landed there and killed him. So I've been to his grave. He's buried in Margraten, Holland. And when Pop Dornick got killed at Bisery, it was very similar. He was walking on a road, shells exploding around him, his men telling him to take cover, and he told them basically, the heck with you, I'm going to just keep walking, and he got killed. We don't know why. This is my first wife who grew up in Madison Heights. She passed away from cancer in 2009, many years after we got divorced, but she was the one that went to school with Purifoy's kids. And this was a little reunion we had at my house about a decade after I started researching. Leo Gillis is a guy who was in F Company, who was with Hurd when he got wounded. And here's Alan Hurd, and here's his buddy Fred Baines from near Buffalo, New York. He's the one that took the color pictures like the one you saw. This is in my house around 1980. And when they were on maneuvers, they loved to raid the local farms in Tennessee and snitch chickens and watermelon, because snitched food always tasted better. But so this is Alan with a piece of watermelon, and this is him with an English bicycle. A lot of them bought those in England before D-Day because they were inexpensive, and paratroopers had more money than they knew what to do with, because they were making twice as much as regular soldiers because of junk pay. This was a newspaper clipping. It's a famous picture, been published many times, and I found this in Alan Hurd's papers when he loaned me all his letters. He sent a clipping home to his parents, and he wrote this caption on here where Churchill's saying, "Too bad Hurd isn't here, Dwight," and Eisenhower saying, "Somebody has to stay and do KP, Winston." So these guys are wearing paratrooper uniforms, but they're not 501 guys, but they look like they could be. These are actually 1st Battalion 506 officers, and 3 of the guys in this picture I interviewed. And when he got to combat, Hurd started collecting Luger pistols, and he told me every time he got a better one, he ditched the last one and upgrade to a better one. And he said, "I came back with the nicest Luger you ever saw." I said, "What'd you do with it?" He said, "Well, one night I got thinking about the war, and I got disgusted, and I threw it in the wastebasket." So I guess it went out with the trash. So here's his friend Pop Dornick, who was a section sergeant of the 2nd Battalion S2 section. And he's the one I told you was despondent and walking on the road, refusing to take cover at Misery when he got killed. And here's Louis Fry, who told the story about Hurd with the Nazi flag in his pocket at the chateau in Misery on Christmas Eve. This is what he looked like during the war. He was a tall, lanky Reb, and this was him in 1984 when he went back for the 40th anniversary. And this is actually down in the cellar where they were when the Germans were singing Christmas carols to them that night before the shooting started. And here's that picture of Alan. You can see the Nazi flag trailing behind him. All right, I take tour groups to Normandy every year. I've been to Normandy 30 times. I've been to Bastogne about 15 times. But in 2007, I had a tour group at Bastogne, and this is the actual courtyard where that incident happened. You can see Fry standing over here. And I brought a Nazi flag with me. So when I told my tour group the story, I stuffed it in my back pocket to illustrate, you know, how it was dragging on the ground behind Hurd when he was shooting all the Nazis in the courtyard. And this is Fry with his daughter Lori at McAuliffe Square. They've got an old tank from the 4th Armored Division parked in the square near the bust of General McAuliffe. It's got a German shell hole in the side of the chassis. And over the decades, I met Alan Hurd for lunch, maybe once every 5 or 10 years, and he came and rode in a patrol car with me when I was a cop one day. But this is down on Congress Street where we met for lunch probably in the 90s. And more than once he asked me, how many former PFCs are now captains of industry? He said, you should write a book about that. I said, I don't really know, but it's an interesting question. And here's me with Bill Sefton. This was only about 6 years ago. I remained friends with him right up till he passed in 2016. And he wrote a book called It Was My War, I'll Remember It the Way I Want to. And Denise has a copy of that book, but Alan Hurd is mentioned in that book quite a bit. And this is a IBM-made M1 carbine that he brought back in his barracks bag. I own it now. I'm almost done here, folks. I just have 2 more slides. This is in Normandy last June. I belong to the World War II Airborne Demonstration Team that jumps at air shows and commemorative events. I've now made 24 jumps, 23 from a C-47, and these planes are now very old. They're almost 80 years old, like this one was made in 1942. But we jump low altitude, static line, 1-second intervals, and we wear World War II uniforms at these events. And I've jumped at Thunder Over Michigan and Willow Run. But this was in Normandy last June for the 75th anniversary. And then I jumped again in September in Holland on September 17th, the exact 75th anniversary of Market Garden. And we jumped at 1 in the afternoon like they did in 1944. We dropped on a 501st drop zone between Erda and Veckel. So, but I didn't come here to talk about me. I think that's the end of it. Okay. Anybody have any questions? Did I cover everything, Denise, or was there something else you wanted me to say? No question?
What's your next book?
Yeah, I went to Afghanistan in 2008 and again in 2010 as an embedded journalist with the 101st Airborne, and I've written a book about that called Deployed. And it's basically done, but I don't have a publisher for it because my old publisher went out of business. So right now, I'm not really actively trying to find a publisher. I got to get motivated and start doing it because all the troops I was with are waiting for it to come out. They told all their relatives and friends, and the book was written about it. And where's the book now? Because it's already over like 12 years since I was over there with them. But I had a very painful personal tragedy in my life in 2016. My only son was murdered in 2016, and he was one of the 49 people at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando when all those people were massacred there. There was over 100 shot, 49 of them died. My son, who was a 32-year-old psychologist in Orlando, was one of the 49 that was killed there. And I'm still struggling with that, and that's one reason why I haven't been productive on my books. But right now I'm working on 4 other books simultaneously. They're all World War II books, and my next project's going to be to push out this book on Afghanistan. But I did find when I embedded with those troops that they were very much like the World War II generation. For one thing, they're all volunteers to serve. Most of them are from small towns or farms or rural areas. They're very well spoken and respectful and polite. And it was just like being back